Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lee Lowry. Hang on one second, make sure this records. Okay. My name is Lee Lowry, and I'm the Executive Director of the American School Health Association. Thank you for joining ASHA and the Coalition to Support Grieving Students for today's webinar, Supporting Grieving Students, Free Resources for School Professionals. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about the American School Health Association. Also known as ASHA, we are the only organization that addresses multiple disciplines in school health and that is devoted solely to school health. Our membership of approximately 700 individuals represents school health, one, as administrators at the local, state, and national levels, two, as health and education professionals in a pre-K through 12 school setting, and three, as academics conducting research that informs school health professionals. We're also the proud publishers of the Journal of School Health, a premier journal in the area of school and adolescent health. Members of ASHA can elect to receive a hard copy or electronic copy of our journal. Our membership is Our membership fee is inexpensive and provides you access to the journal and also to our weekly e-newsletter, School Health Action, as well as free continuing education hours through approved webinars like today and through CE qualifying JOSH articles. If you haven't already, please consider joining, volunteering, and becoming a member of the ASHA community. Visit us at ashaweb.org to learn more. Our 2017 conference will be held between October 11th and 13th in St. Louis, Missouri. Please join us to meet, share, and inspire ideas and conversation with like-minded school health professionals. We will have 4 interdisciplinary-based tracks during our conference: the Administration, Coordination, and Leadership track, Programs and Services, Research and Emerging Issues, and Teaching and Learning. If you're interested in submitting a session for one or more tracks, our call for abstracts is now open. The deadline was recently extended to April 10th, and it gives you time to get started today. Conference registration will open in early May. Visit ashaweb.org for more information on submitting abstracts and attending the conference. As I mentioned, the continuing education credit for today's webinar is free for all members. If you're a non-member and you would like to receive CE credit for this webinar, the cost is $30. After the webinar, you can receive one Category 1 Advanced CE/CH for MCHES and CHES, one contact hour for continuing nursing education, or a certificate of attendance based on 70% or more participation today. Participation is measured by the amount of time the webinar remains active on your screen. We'll provide details for obtaining CE in a post-webinar email that will go out in the next few days. Before I introduce you to our speaker today, I'd like to share a little bit about a framework that unites ASHA's diverse membership. ASHA believes that schools have a responsibility to meet the needs of the whole child. The whole school, whole community, whole child, or WISC model, developed jointly by the CDC and ASCD, provides a framework for the health and education sectors at the state and local levels to work towards stronger alignment, integration, and collaboration. This approach puts the student in the center to ensure that all students are safe, healthy, engaged, supported, and challenged. This holistic and synergistic approach requires schools, students, families, and community partners to focus on improving both health and educational outcomes, and to create schools that nurture and support all students. It is a team effort, and collaboration is the key to success. A multidisciplinary approach that involves school nurses, counselors, health educators, physical educators, community experts, administrators, and students can better leverage resources and expertise to address the needs of the whole child, meeting the child's physical, emotional, social, and academic needs. Using the knowledge and wisdom of this school health team and research, schools can develop policies and programs that support all students, keep them safe from physical or emotional harm, and empower them to take responsibility for their own health and well-being. All of ASHA's webinars tie back to this model, and today's topic of supporting grieving students is no exception. tying into the counseling, psychological, and social services portion, as well as helping building a supportive social and emotional climate for students. A couple of notes before we begin. Your phones will remain muted for the 60-minute duration of this webinar. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box on the left-hand screen, and we will try to address them at the end of the presentation. We are trying to record today's presentation. I'm not sure if that's actually working. And if it does work, we will send you a link to the recording as well as to the evaluation survey within the next couple of days. Now, let's get started with today's session and an introduction of Dr. David Schonfeld, who will be presenting today. Dr. Schonfeld is a developmental behavioral pediatrician and director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. He's a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council and served as a commissioner for both the National Commission on Children and Disasters and the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission in Connecticut. Dr. Schonfeld established the School Crisis Response Program in 1991 while faculty at Yale University School of Medicine, which provided training to tens of thousands of school-related personnel in school systems throughout the country and abroad, and provided technical assistance in hundreds of school crisis events. The goal of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement is to promote an appreciation of the role schools can serve to support students, staff, and families at times of crisis and loss, to collaborate with organizations and agencies to further this goal, and to serve as a resource for information, training materials, consultation, and technical assistance. Dr. Schonfeld has provided consultation and training on school crisis and pediatric bereavement in the aftermath of a number of school crisis events and disasters within the United States and abroad, including school and community shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, Marysville, Washington, Aurora, Colorado, and Chardon, Ohio, flooding from Hurricane Sandy and Katrina and Ike, tornadoes in Joplin, Missouri, and Alabama. Thank you, Dr. Schonfeld, for joining us today. At this time, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you. So my goal today is to talk about a little bit further about how we can support grieving students in schools, and in particular also to highlight a resource that's available freely for professional development and technical support through the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. And I do want to acknowledge that ASHA is actually a supporting organizational member of the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. So let me first start by talking about the extent of the issue. Well, first off, there was a survey that was done back in October of 2012 by the American Federation of Teachers, the New York Life Foundation, Tiller Inc., and Hart Research Associates, and it involved more than 1,200 members of the AFT. 90% of the educators reported that grief is a serious problem that they felt deserves more attention in schools. The teachers reported that they wanted to provide support and assistance to their students who were grieving and recognized that they had grieving students in their classes. But the most important barrier preventing them from providing this support was insufficient training and/or professional development. In fact, 93% of classroom teachers reported that they had never received any bereavement training at any point in their career, and only 3% said that it was currently available in their school or district. Now, this contrasts sharply to the experience of loss in children. The vast majority of children experience the death of a family member or a close friend by the time they complete high school. Surveys have shown that that's ranged at about the 90% level. And about 4 to 5% of U.S. children will specifically experience the death of a parent by the age of 16. So it's highly likely, therefore, that you see a grieving child every day you're in school, even if you don't actually see any children who appear to be grieving. The reality is that most children will adjust to even a major loss, but that doesn't mean that they don't grieve, and it also doesn't mean that grieving isn't extremely difficult. I'm going to play a couple brief clips, video clips, and we hope you can hear them well. And this first clip is about a 2 or 3 minute introductory clip that was used for the introduction of a webinar that I did for Scholastic several years ago for educators on this topic. So I'm going to play this clip and hold the phone over the speaker, and we hope that works well.
wasn't paying attention in class a lot. And whenever they would ask me a question, I would be spaced out.
Once or twice I would bring up my dad, and everybody would be like, oh, do you want to talk about something else? A lot of people stayed away from me and didn't really talk to me a lot.
A lot of my teachers actually did not do a lot, which was not helpful at all. It makes you feel kind of awkward, makes you feel very, very alone.
Teachers don't understand that even though it was a long time ago, it's still really hard for me.
All the books that you pick up and read talk about how to handle a student in the first year, but very rarely do they address, okay, now this year is done, how are we going to handle them for the rest of the time? Because it doesn't go away and kids don't get over it.
There was no training for loss or tragedy in my principalship training, and I always felt as if it was something that was really needed.
I think that some part of the lesson plan should be geared toward understanding grief, understanding when a parent dies, how the child may feel.
It's really important that the student kind of be guided to where they can go just in case they need to talk to someone.
So what we find is that it is a common experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about the experiences of some of these children as we go on. But even though children are grieving in class, they may not appear to be grieving, and there's many reasons for that. One is that adults may just unwittingly communicate to children that death is not to be openly discussed. So if you think about it, if a child brings up something about a personal experience related to loss in the general public, goes up to, let's say a young child goes up to someone in the grocery store, if they were to start a conversation about something else, for example, to say that their mother was going to have a baby, most strangers would actually continue the conversation and ask, is it going to be a boy or a girl? Are you excited about being a big brother or a big sister? But if the same child went up to someone in the grocery store and said that their brother had died and they're going to a funeral, most people don't continue that conversation. And kids pick up very quickly that these conversations are uncomfortable or inappropriate. Now, if you think about what happens within a family, if there is, say, a parent who dies suddenly, and the surviving parent communicates that to a child, well, often what will happen is the child will ask a question, usually a poignant question such as, does that mean I'll never see my mom again? And at that point, the surviving parent usually starts crying. The child doesn't think that their parent is expressing an emotion that they are starting to feel themselves and that it's useful to grieve together. In most situations, the child will just say, it's okay, Mom, or it's okay, Dad. I can do everything that Mom or Dad used to do. We're going to be okay. And ends up, therefore, reassuring the parent, but also realizes that they're not supposed to bring this up, and they may think they've done something naughty by upsetting their parent. Now, there are other reasons that children don't communicate this. Children may, for example, not yet understand what's happened, or they may, for example, not understand the full implications of what it means for them and their family. One of the things that we talk about is secondary losses after a death. So when someone dies, you lose not only the person, and that's the primary loss, but you lose everything that person can or would be able to do for you in the future, and that's the secondary loss. So children don't necessarily anticipate the secondary losses the same way adults do. I was talking to a father whose wife died in a car accident, leaving him with 2 young children, and I asked him how he was doing, and he said, well, I'm a laborer. My wife was the nurturer. I live in dread of the day that my daughter has her first period. Now, the daughter was about 5 years old, and I don't think she was living in dread of that. That's not to mean that she won't miss her mother deeply when that event occurs in her life, but she's probably at 5 not anticipating that or recognizing what that future loss will mean to her. So sometimes children don't even if they understand the death, they don't understand all of the implications of it. Children may also be so overwhelmed by their feelings that they frankly don't want to talk about it in a school setting. Even if they go and meet privately with a counselor or someone else to talk about their loss and their associated feelings, they may worry that they're not going to be able to pull it together and go to math class immediately afterwards. So they may decide just not to talk about it in school at all. Or children may express their grief indirectly through their behavior or through their play. There are many games that children play that have death as a central theme. And there's one game that's played in all cultures around the world starting in the second half of the first year of life, which people have said is one of the first games about death. So in the first year of life, when children are, only a couple months old, for example, they don't have yet object permanence. So when something is out of sight, we believe it is literally out of mind. Once children start to develop object permanence, they will have sometimes stranger anxiety and separation problems because they start to worry that people are not the same as those they're familiar with, and they also worry about losing those that are close to them. So as they start to develop that object permanence in the second half of the first year of life, a game that children play, again, in all cultures around the world, is peekaboo. And in that game, the child fixes their gaze on someone. There's separation as if the person has died. There's heightened awareness and concern, and then joy at reunion. And the children play it over and over again for quite a long period of time. And you have to ask yourself, why are they so actively engaged in a game which is really fairly simple? I always tell people, never start playing peekaboo when you're on a long flight with the child in the seat in front of you, because they will continue it for much of the flight. So peekaboo, actually, when you translate it literally from Old English, peekaboo translates to alive or dead. And that is what the game is about. And later there will be other games like hide and seek and other variations where the theme remains loss and or death. So children may communicate their concerns indirectly through their behavior or play. What happens, though, is although children are ready to talk about this and engage in the game of peekaboo, most adults don't even know that's what the game is about. And most adults don't think they know what to say to make things better, and they're often afraid that they're just going to upset children by bringing this up, or that they're going to say the wrong thing and unnecessarily make matters worse. So instead, they say nothing. But saying nothing says a lot to children. It communicates that adults are either unaware, unconcerned, uncaring, unable, or unwilling to be of assistance. These are all very negative messages that we would not want to convey to children, particularly children who are grieving. The silence leaves very young children confused about what has happened, and it leaves younger and older children unsupported and requires children of all ages to grieve alone. So what I wanted to do was go over what are some of the wrong things to say. Because people tell me if they know what the wrong things to say are, then they can avoid them. And they find it helpful to go over this. This slide is just an example of the wrong thing to say. Here, a surgeon comes out and says, if it's any consolation, he seemed like a bit of a jerk. Now, most people would know not to ever say something like that. But there are many things that people say that are well-intentioned and quite common, and are probably not the most appropriate. Now, I do want to clarify before I go into these examples that these are not absolutely the wrong things to say. They are just things to reconsider and to be a little more conscious of as you're talking to someone who's grieving. It is also something, these are recommendations for the situation where you are a professional working with a child who is a patient or a client or student. It would be very different if you were talking to your own child or you were talking to a peer or other family members. And these recommendations are generally for when you have acute grief, when the child's just been recently notified. There may be differences if you're talking about a death that has occurred, for example, several years in the past. So the first thing is you don't want to try to cheer up survivors. I tell people anything that begins with "at least" is probably something that should be reconsidered. Comments like "at least he's not in pain anymore," "at least you have another brother," "at least you were able to spend your birthday with your mother." These comments tend to try and encourage people not to grieve openly. The motivation is, to be quite honest, the witness is uncomfortable by the distress that the griever is showing, and therefore is trying to get them to stop crying or be upset or say negative things, and is therefore trying to have them look like they're not as much in distress. It doesn't actually diminish the distress. Instead, it just lets the griever know that you are uncomfortable with their open communication. Similarly, you don't want to encourage people who are grieving to be strong or to cover their emotions. Now, the next point on here is a lot of times people say to me, well, if I do talk with children or I allow them to cry in my presence, I'll get upset and I might feel choked up or become a little tearful. And quite honestly, it's perfectly fine to express your own feelings and demonstrate empathy as long as it's genuine. So for example, if I go to a school and there's a teacher that's died, I wouldn't say, oh, Mrs. Smith, I miss her so much. She was a wonderful woman. Because if the student looks at me and says, oh, did you know her? And I say, no, actually, I've never met her. That really seems like it's not genuine. But you could say, I've never met Mrs. Smith, but from what I hear about her already, she sounds like she was a wonderful woman and meant a lot to a number of people in the school here. It really makes me sad to see that you've lost someone that's important to you. Now, that's a genuine statement of empathy, and you can express your feelings. And to be quite honest, I work with a lot of physicians, and they tell me, well, I might get tearful, and that looks unprofessional. And what I tell them is, if you're notifying a family that a child has died, for example, under your care, and you show some human emotion, that's a good thing. Families will usually conclude that you must care about their child, and therefore you deliver the best care possible. If you instead look insensitive and cold and uncaring, they're more likely to get upset. So it is fine to express feelings and demonstrate empathy. If you are going to feel overwhelmed by your feelings, let's say you have your own personal loss experience, or this reminds you of something else in your past, and you feel that you can't actually carry on a conversation or attend to the needs of the other person, then it's probably more appropriate to ask someone to fill in for you and to talk to the child or the family. But the expression of common feelings and empathy is not a bad thing. I would avoid statements such as, I know exactly what you're going through. You really can't know how someone else feels unless you ask them. You don't want to say things like, you must be angry, because you don't want to tell people how they ought to feel. And you also should be careful about sharing your own personal loss experiences, which I find adults often do to show that they have some relevant experience. Your relevant experience can be participating in a webinar, learning something in school. You do not need to share your personal experiences when you're dealing with patients or clients. And again, this would be very different if you were talking to family or friends where you would be looking for mutual support. But this is a situation where it's all about the grieving child, who is, in this case, either a client or a patient or someone in your professional capacity you're there to support. Whenever you do share your personal experiences with individuals, you form comparisons. And there pretty much is only two ways those comparisons can go. Either you beat them. So this example, both my parents died when I was your age, might actually be seen as competing for sympathy. You draw some of the attention away from the griever if the example that you give is worse than their experience. So if a child comes in and says, my dog died, and you say, oh, I'm so sorry, I was just at my mother's funeral this weekend, then the child has to turn around and ask how you're doing and provide support to you, and may therefore feel uncomfortable sharing their personal experience or talking further about it. When you share your personal experience, you may not beat them. You may actually say something which pales by comparison, and in some situations that can be seen as insulting. I knew about one nurse who told a family whose infant had died that weekend that she knew what they were going through because she just lost her dog, and they were deeply insulted by that. So whenever you share your personal experience, you form a comparison, and either you win and you draw the attention away from the griever, or you lose and you insult them. So it often does not actually go to, it's not advantageous to do that. So I would generally tell people, draw on your personal experience, but don't share it. And that's just a general recommendation. What you really want to do is to allow the child and the family to be upset and tolerate their unpleasant affect without trying to change it. I would accept their reactions while suspending judgment. We tend to try and decide, is this normal or is this abnormal? And quite honestly, when people have just found out very difficult news, such as the death of someone that they care deeply about, it's hard to know exactly how to act. Having said that, I would intervene only when safety and health is concerned. If they voice any suicidal or homicidal thoughts or intentions, if they're drinking and they're going to get in a car and drive, the adults, for example, if they're engaging in certain risky behaviors, you want to intervene and preserve safety. But I would say short of that, I tend to just accept at least their initial reactions without trying to judge it. Because once you judge it, you often distance yourself from the person you're trying to give support. So let me turn now to some of the common types of reactions you can see and how to address them. So the first I'm going to talk about is children's guilt. We know that thought processes in children are limited in a number of ways. One way is what we call egocentrism. Calvin explains it quite well. He says, I'm at peace with the world. I'm completely serene. And Hobbes asks, why is that? He says, I've discovered my purpose in life. I know why I was put here and why everything exists. And Hobbes says, oh, really? And he says, yes, I'm here so everybody can do what I want. That's the egocentrism of a young child. Calvin is even more perceptive. So when Hobbes says it's nice to have that cleared up, he explains, once everyone accepts it, they'll be serene too. Now, they face loss in the same way from an egocentric perspective. Here he says, don't die, little raccoon. It wouldn't be very grateful of you to break my heart. That's an egocentric perspective of a child facing death or loss. But it is also the type of reaction that you will see in older children and adults as well, including professionals. I even remember times where I would hear about patients being brought to the emergency room that had found dead. The mother had found the baby dead in a crib. And I knew that they were coming in from a call from the ambulance. And my first thought was, this is going to take a long time and I'm probably going to miss dinner. It's a self-centered thought. It is egocentric. But professionals are also people, and they therefore will have those thoughts. And attending to your own personal needs without compromising the needs of your patients or clients is very appropriate. So it would be inappropriate for me to go to the cafeteria and have dinner just so that I didn't miss the cafeteria hours. That would be inappropriate if it compromised the care to the family. It would not be inappropriate for me to ask a colleague to pick something up for me so I could have it later when I'm done working with the family. So just because you have self-centered views when you're under stress does not mean you are unprofessional. But children, it tends to be very egocentric. Children also have limited understanding of causality. They don't know why many things happen, and death is one of them. And it's an important thing not to understand for them. Once they're faced with the loss, they have to come up with some explanation. Otherwise, it would feel like anyone could die at any moment for any reason. And so therefore, they try and elaborate some understanding. Well, if they're egocentric and they don't understand the cause, they tend to elaborate explanations that place themselves as a central cause of it. And that's what we call magical thinking. They will assume their thoughts, their actions, their wishes, their desires, or their failures to act may have led directly to the outcome. Now, magical thinking is often reinforced by adults, and it is appropriate in children. So I'm not in any way discouraging the use of magical thinking, but we have to recognize the fact that when children believe that their thoughts and wishes can make great things happen, it also means that they believe that their thoughts and wishes can cause tragedy, and that they are responsible. So there's a real downside to magical thinking. So the example I often give is Santa Claus. And I should say my children were raised to believe in Santa Claus, and I have nothing against Santa and engaged in those conversations with my own children. So it's not a criticism of the whole story of Santa Claus. But if you tell your child that on December 5th, if they eat their string beans at dinner, somebody that they've never met in person who lives at the North Pole, even though they've never been there, is going to somehow know about that and care deeply enough to instruct elves to make a toy of your liking and to hold on to it for several weeks, put it in a sled, pulled by reindeer. I think most of you know the story that follows. If you actually believe that that's a cause and effect relationship, eat your string beans, and all of that happens, then that means if you kick your sister and 2 weeks later she develops cancer and dies, that's your fault. And I would say in the latter case that that's actually more believable than the whole Santa Claus thing. So you do need to realize that the magical thinking is so prevalent, and it really leads to people feeling strongly guilty. And people might think it's illogical, but actually it is logical for them if they believe in magical thinking. And so this guilt continues well into adolescence and adulthood. And I have been doing this work for over 30 years now. And so far I would say there's probably 2 or maybe 3 cases where I didn't identify the guilt that children felt. And the same's true with the adults as well. Sometimes it takes a little while before the children feel comfortable enough, but I tend to make sure that I reassure children of their lack of responsibility for death, even when adults might not think there's any reason they would think that way. There is a reason. It's called magical thinking. Um, so I often will say when something bad happens, we often feel badly. And when we feel badly, we often think there's something we did that was bad. And, thoughts and feelings and wishes don't make people die. But a lot of times children tell me that they think they were responsible for it, even when there wasn't anything they did. And then I just ask them, I wonder if any of you have felt that way. I talked to one class of third and fourth graders many years ago, and it was just a general presentation that the teacher had invited because there were some children who had experienced losses in the class. And after the presentation, the students were instructed to write letters. And I got a packet of letters, and one of them just said, "Dear Dr. Schonfeld, thank you for coming and talking to our class about what happens when someone dies. Now I know it's not my fault my father killed himself. Have a happy Valentine's Day." And the girl signed her name. Now, I'm not suggesting that simple comments can eliminate guilt feelings in individuals who are grieving, even in children. But I will say that simple explanations and discussion can start the process of at least having them disclose their guilt feelings so that you know they're there. Now, I remember working with one child and go through the whole story, but the infant was found dead, and when they were taking a history in the emergency department, they realized that the child had been in the emergency department a couple of months prior and had a facial cellulitis and was started on some antibiotics. Through some miscommunication, the antibiotic prescription was recorded improperly, and the parent was instructed to give 1 tablespoon of the medication instead of 1 teaspoon multiple times a day. So the child was actually dosed excessively. But the infection cleared. This was several months prior. And to be quite honest, the medication had enough of a margin of safety that the extra amount wouldn't have caused any harm. Actually, it would have been better than having a lower amount. It was really just an incidental finding, but because of the conversation in the emergency department, the mother started to feel guilty about it. She had about an 8-year-old boy at the time, and it wasn't until she asked me to speak with him. And once I got to know him and I was talking about this, he finally just looked at me and he said, I should have known to have checked the prescription. I should have looked myself at the bottle, and then my brother wouldn't have died. It was my fault. Now, no one knew he had even overheard the conversations about the dosing, and the dosing was irrelevant anyway. But he was carrying around this guilt feeling. Now, part of this tends to be that individuals have, perhaps at an unconscious level, a decision to make. Either you feel guilty and believe that you had some control over this, or you accept the reality in most situations you have no control. And that means it can happen again. So some individuals, at least at an unconscious level, may opt for guilt feelings as opposed to recognizing their true vulnerability. So a lot of times the guilt is present, it often isn't expressed, and it sometimes is difficult to dissuade. So here Calvin calls for his mom and he says, "A big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs. I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost my best friend." And his mother says, "Well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen." And Calvin observes there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So again, I would anticipate the guilt is there, and I would reassure children, and for that matter, adults, of their lack of responsibility. I've gone to multiple schools when there has been a mass casualty event, a shooting, and in the situations where the shooter has been a former student in the school system, I've even gone back to the elementary schools and talked about this phenomenon, and I've had a number of teachers, second grade teachers, kindergarten teachers, who tell me that as soon as they heard about the shooting, they felt guilty because they taught the child 10 years ago and failed to recognize his potential as a shooter and didn't take appropriate steps or actions. So it's just so prevalent. I'd underscore that it continues into adolescence and adulthood. Another limitation may be that children don't understand things because of their cognitive abilities at younger ages. So if we know for young children their thought processes are fairly concrete and literal. Here Calvin asks if the milk is spoiled, and his mom says, "Smell it and see." And he says, "I'm not going to smell it, you smell it." She doesn't ask why he's so concerned. She gets irritated and she says, "Oh, for goodness sake, here, it's fine." And then Calvin explains, "I don't take chances with a product that prints the date you might expire." So you will find that children will have these literal misinterpretations, and they're often quite funny, but sometimes they can be scary as well. So, for example, you may tell a child about the funeral plans in the wake and say that the body is placed in a casket, and then ask if they'd like to go to the wake. And they might say, I don't want to see that, that's disgusting. And it is often assumed then that the children just are afraid of seeing a dead body. But in some situations, if you tell children the body is placed in a casket, they assume the head is placed someplace else. And what they don't want to see is a family member that they care about decapitated. But if you don't ask them what they're concerned about, you often will miss that. So I've had kids who, have had ongoing distress because they misunderstood something that was said to them, something very simple. I had one child, for example, who had a classmate who passed out in class, and she assumed it was from the same medical condition that she had, and because they waited too long for treatment. Well, it turned out that all she got was passed, and she thought it meant passed away. Well, the girl had not actually died, she had fainted. And this went on for 2 years, where the child was having excessive treatment, emergency room visits, agitation in the emergency room, until finally I talked with her about her experiences. She disclosed this to me, and once we clarified that it wasn't that her friend passed away, it was that her friend passed out. And the child had, left school that day and hadn't returned because it was the end of the school year, and then switched schools. So from the child's perception, her friend had died from what she had. I also worked with another child with sickle cell who was about 12 years old. And he was admitted to the hospital for these dizzy spells that they thought might be small strokes. And only after about 4 or 5 days, when I got to know the child, he finally confided in me that he was the oldest child in the clinic with sickle cell disease. And when I asked him what that meant, he said, well, I suppose then you die. I said, no, at 13 we transferred to the adult clinic across the street. Pointed out another patient who was much older, who was on the ward at the same time with sickle cell. He talked to him, and after a couple of minutes he just decided he was no longer dizzy and he was ready to go home. So simple misunderstandings and misconceptions and literal misinterpretations can cause a great deal of distress in children, and sometimes are related to death and loss experiences. For that reason, religious explanations can be shared predominantly by family members and faith-based organizations at any age, but they should not be relied upon as the only explanation of death, because often they're fairly abstract and they can be easily misunderstood by children, leading to more distress. So I remember seeing one boy whose brother died of sudden infant death syndrome, and the explanation that was given to him by his parents was that he was such a good little infant, God wanted him back at his side as an angel. So this boy made sure that whenever he went to church, which he knew was God's home, that he wanted to make sure he misbehaved because he didn't want to be seen as angel potential and be called to the other side. His parents did not appreciate this for months, and didn't even make the association between his very clear misbehavior in church and what they had said to him, or that it was even related to the death of the sibling. So you just need to be cautious with some of the religious explanations because, again, they tend not to be as well understood. So what you want to do is share those religious belief systems. That's perfectly fine, but couple that with practical information and knowledge about the physical realities of what happens to the body of someone after they've died. You can find information for talking to children in a number of places, and I wanted to highlight at grievingstudents.org. I'll tell you more about the website. If you go to the link for ordering free materials, you'll actually be able to download this booklet called After a Loved One Dies. And this is for adults, parents, guardians, and other caring adults that take care of children after a death. And so you could use it in practice settings or to distribute it at schools, for example. It's available in English and Spanish. We have Chinese and Japanese translations as well posted. And you can actually order hard copies in English or Spanish at no charge. The New York Life Foundation is currently paying for the shipping and handling, and you can order them in bulk copies as well for use in your school and to have them on hand. Let me turn to a little bit of practical advice. The first I wanted to talk about was funeral attendance. A lot of times people ask me, well, how old should a child be before they can go to a funeral or a wake or other memorial or commemorative event? And I tell people, if you can have a conversation with the child, explain what's going to happen, not just what's going to happen to the body, but also there may be people crying, there may be people telling stories, and sometimes even laughing at pleasant memories about the person that died. Help them to understand what the experience is going to be like to the extent that you can in simple terms, and then invite them to participate. I would never force or coerce a child to participate. I wouldn't make them come or do something that they're very uncomfortable with. I also think it's useful to assign a mentor, someone who can sit with the child or be with them throughout throughout the wake or the funeral, and see how they're doing. And if at any point you have any question, just ask to step out with the child and talk with them and ask them if they want to go back. Is there something else that they would rather do? And then they can participate to the level that they wish. Having done that, I have never had any difficulty with children attending funerals, and they've never regretted having been there. The person who mentors them through the experience should be someone who knows the child, but who also is not personally grieving to a great degree. So it might actually be someone from the school, or it could be a babysitter or a neighbor or a distant relative. You also want to be aware of community resources and offer them to families and provide checkup and follow-up. Follow children over time, and remember that grieving is a long-term process. And in some situations, the second year may actually even be more difficult than the first year for some people, because in the first year they don't expect to do anything except just make it through the year. So the first Thanksgiving, they may get a lot of support. People show a lot of concern. They don't expect to enjoy it if a family member has died. But then on the second year, often those supports are not there, and people start to realize it's still not fun. And they start to worry, will they ever experience joy or satisfaction again? So you do want to recognize that this is really a lifelong process and be prepared to support kids over time. This next video clip just shows grief triggers and how they can occur within classroom settings. It's just a couple minutes long, so let me just play this.
Right now, my biology class is studying blood vessels, and my dad died of an aneurysm. So we were talking about disorders, and my teacher talked about aneurysm, and she asked what could happen with an aneurysm, and I raised my hand and I told her that it could burst, and if that was in the brain, it could be fatal. So we talked about that, and it's not my biology teacher's fault. It's the unit. I understand that completely. But it's a reminder of how ironic things can be sometimes. Someone can say something that's not relevant to them, but it can have a really big effect on you. Today in Spanish class, actually, my friend Kate, she's a great friend of mine, we were joking because we had a biology test the previous period, and it was a pretty hard test. So we were joking, we were saying that we were going to get heart attacks or we were going to pass out, and she was like, hey, I have an aneurysm. And she was like, she just kind of began shaking and stuff, and I didn't get mad at her because she didn't understand, and I hadn't told her because I just met her this year. On a Father's Day in 3rd grade, we were making bookmarks that said father, and then we would write words, and the teacher was explaining it, and I was like right about to cry because I couldn't make one. So I asked to go to the bathroom, and then I started crying in the bathroom.
Teachers look for overt signs, but grief is more subtle than that. It's not always Father's Day that's going to trigger a grief. It could be career day. It could be what does your parent do for a living that is going to trigger it.
So grief triggers are quite common, and I think we need to prepare children and let them know that they can occur in the classroom setting. Teacher might say something that reminds them of the person that died. Substitute teacher might have the same perfume as mother who had died. They might be singing a song in music class that just reminds them of a song that their parent or their sibling liked or sang frequently before they died. So anything could pretty much trigger and these reactions, and they can be very overwhelming to children if they feel that they're going to start crying or lose their composure in classroom. So what you want to do is prepare them for that and come up with a safety plan. provide a safe space or an adult the student can talk to, and set procedures for the student to obtain support without asking for help while they're feeling overwhelmed. So for example, one teacher told me she just worked out with the student that whenever he was feeling a grief trigger, he could take a tissue from the box near the door and just step out, and she knew where he was going. They had made arrangements for whether, they go to a classroom across the hall, to the library, to go speak to a counselor or a school nurse or school social worker. Sometimes you can let the student call a parent or family member if it's really necessary, and provide permission and encouragement to see the school nurse or counselor, and offer private time with the teacher to talk about feelings, outside of the classroom. The issue is if children know they can leave, they generally don't feel like they have to. Part of what's so overwhelming is the feeling of being trapped and that you can't escape and that you'll embarrass yourself. And if you know you can get up if you need to, you often can sit there, and usually these reactions pass fairly quickly. You can also think through how to minimize the number of grief triggers that work. So if you're going to be doing a drug abuse lesson and you know that the child's sibling died from a drug overdose, you'd want to speak with the child beforehand and ask how they would like to handle that. That's kind of is clearer. But there may also be grief triggers that you don't know specifically about the kid's experiences, but you can anticipate someone will have that. So if you were going to do that activity with the Father's Day card or poem that the child mentioned in the video, I would certainly introduce that by saying some of you may not have a father who's currently living with you or alive. You can still do the exercise by thinking of your memories of your dad, or you can pick another male who helped raise you or support you through your childhood. That way we can all participate. That's just respectful of the fact that children have different experiences, not only deaths of parents, but a parent who may be incarcerated, deployed, unknown to them, divorced or separated. So you just want to be respectful that those things do occur. The last point that I wanted to go over is the importance of professional self-care. We need to recognize it's distressing to be with people in general, and children in particular, who are grieving and otherwise in distress. If someone is crying up or upset, it's hard to feel like you're helping them even when you are. So it's really important that staff find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children who are grieving or traumatized, and that impact that it has on them both personally and professionally. I remember talking to one superintendent who had experienced the deaths of a number of students in a bus accident that occurred several years prior. And he stayed after to speak with me after I gave a presentation. And at one point he just started crying and he said, it still bothers me that these kids are dead. And then he looked at me and said, maybe I should retire. And my comment to him was very clear. The day you wake up and it doesn't matter to you if the kids are dead or alive, that's the day you retire. It's not a problem to care about children. That's actually what we should do. The problem is what that caring does to us and how we take care of ourselves. I went to one school to prepare the school for the start of the school year that had a number of losses. A community-based shooting had occurred, where a number of recent graduates had died. There were some suicides that happened several years ago. A staff member died of a natural occurring illness. So there was a number of losses, but none of them happened in the school. But still, the principal thought the staff could benefit from this. Well, actually, one of the teachers came up to me on Friday afternoon. The kids were returning on Monday, and she confided in me that she hadn't been able to walk into her classroom to set it up for classes on Monday, and she didn't know if she could. And when I asked her why, she just looked at me and said, I can't set up my classroom because then I'm going to come in and I'm going to meet a whole other group of kids, and I don't think I can bear to have one of them die. So she wasn't even sure she could continue teaching or go into her classroom. Now, fortunately, we provided support, and she ended up coming in on Monday morning and telling the principal, this is where I need to be, and she went in and started teaching. But we have to recognize this is hard work. So the last couple slides are just some resources for you. I mentioned the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. It includes 10 major professional organizations representing school professionals, 2 major teachers unions, 4 administrator organizations, organizations representing school counselors, school nurses, school social workers, and school counselors. And there are a number of supporting organizational members that joined after the coalition had already released their work, and that includes the American School Health Association. The website that we developed is grievingstudents.org. It has over 20 video-based modules that cover a range of topics, including what to say to children, but also how to deal with suicide, crisis events, children who have potentially life-limiting conditions. And in addition to those video modules, which I'm just going to skip over that, we also, and it covers these broad categories, and I said there are over 20. There also are guidance documents, practical guidelines that have been developed by the center on how to respond to the death of a student or staff from all causes. There's one just on suicide. Parent book I mentioned. There's articles. There are other online resources. And lastly, I just wanted to mention the center. The center was already described. We have our own website, a separate website I should say, schoolcrisiscenter.org. And we have a toll-free number so that if you call the center, we provide free technical assistance and consultation if you're dealing with a school crisis event. And if you call after hours, we're on the West Coast, Pacific time, you'll get the hospital operators at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and they can contact me if there's been a crisis and you wish some advice. So I'm going to stop here so that people can ask questions. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schonfeld. I do want to, again, at this time, invite people to submit questions. We don't have many, so feel free, and we may be able to answer them.
I know there was a question about the PowerPoint, and in addition to the PowerPoint that you will get sent to you within the next couple of days for this talk, if you go to the website, we actually do have 3 teacher training modules under the additional resources section. Those will be, they're fairly extensive, that's why there are 3 of them, so that you can do just part 1. If you did all 3 parts, it probably would take about 3 hours, but you can modify them. And that includes not only the PowerPoint presentations as well as video links to the material that's on the website, but it also includes, if you open it in the notes version, the full transcript of the presentation. And it is editable so that you can, modify it as you wish and use that as a template if you're trying to do teacher training or training to others in the school.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, one of our questions that came in has to do with someone who's, from a personal experience, their son attends a school in a small rural town, and their classmate recently committed suicide, and her son is having a hard time with it. She's just wondering if you have any tips or recommendations for that situation.
Certainly. So if you go on to the additional resources section, you'll actually see a guidance document on how to respond to a death by suicide. And it includes some scripts for students at different developmental levels, as well as, step-by-step guidance. But some key points that I would make is, first off, if this is your child, you definitely want to talk with them about how they feel about this, and also give them some sense of an understanding of generally why people might kill themselves. I actually avoid using the phrase committed suicide because some people think committed is linked with crimes, and so we tend to say more that they died by suicide. So what I tell children is that although we don't know the reason why the person killed themselves, generally, in most situations, people have died by suicide because they either had depression or another mental health problem, or they were abusing alcohol or other drugs. And it is not a logical act from someone who's decided consciously not to continue living for some particular reasons, but it is rather an illogical act from someone who's having clouded thinking or difficulty thinking clearly. Again, these are generalizations, but I think if you try and make it sound too simple, so for example, for very young children, if you say, well, Daddy was very, very sad, so he killed himself, but then the child looks around and everyone's very, very sad, and they're going to worry that everyone's going to die or kill themselves. So you don't want to be too simplistic in the reason, and you also don't want to associate stigma with it. The other thing which I do tell children in school settings is that sometimes individuals who are thinking of hurting themselves do share that information with friends or others and may ask those friends to keep it as a secret. What we do is we say, no one should ever keep that kind of secret for a friend. It's the same way a friend wouldn't let another friend drink and drive. You don't keep a secret of a friend who is saying they're going to hurt themselves. And that you then spend some time in the post-pension talking about where they can go with concerns about the safety of themselves or others, and what they can do if they have a friend or a colleague or some other family member who is perhaps at risk of killing themselves, whether they have depression or if it hasn't been treated effectively, or because they have substance abuse which is not well controlled and it hasn't been treated, for example. And so the resources should include both people they can speak with at home and within the school, as well as confidential sources of information they may be able to get at hotlines, particularly if they're older children.
Great, thank you. We have another question coming in that says, that asks, how would you conduct a grief support group within a school setting? Are there any curriculums that you recommend?
There aren't particular curriculums that I recommend. I think there are certain mechanisms for doing that. There are already bereavement support groups out in the community in many communities around the country. In fact, if you look back at that slide, there's one bullet under the resources that talks about where you can go. You can also get it through grievingstudents.org, where you can get a map of the United States, and you click on the particular state, and you download a PDF which includes all of the current contact information for all the bereavement camps and centers in a particular state that are divided by area. So one option is to partner with one of these bereavement support groups, and a number of these centers will also provide groups in schools. They'll actually come to the school and staff those, or they can provide some training or share the current model that they're using. To be quite honest, bereavement support is not considered a clinical treatment. Bereavement is considered a normative experience, and so grief is not an illness, and as a result, it doesn't result in treatment. And the reason I go through this is it also means it usually isn't paid for by health insurance, and as a result, you will find most people who do bereavement support are actually either lay people who receive some training, or they are faith-based groups who may not have a lot of experience in pediatric bereavement. And so as a result, it isn't the treatment of an illness, so we don't have clear outcome measures, because if you don't have an illness to begin with, you can't effectively treat it. So as a result, some of the models that are used are really just based on best practices, and so it's hard to evaluate other than to make sure that it's with a group that has had good experience and is well respected in the community. A lot of them have also joined the National Alliance for Grieving Children. Our center is a member of that alliance, and they are trying to disseminate and establish best practices. So you can also look to them for some advice.
Okay, excellent. Here's an interesting question, and I'm not sure if it falls within your expertise, but I imagine you've seen it before. Are there best practices regarding how a school should handle media coverage, visits from the media following a tragic event, such as a student dying in a car crash?
Sure. We do see that a fair bit. The media can be a challenge. Sometimes the media can be helpful if they disseminate useful information about resources, but often they do sensationalize. And so what we recommend, if it's been a very high-profile event, is that you have conscious or proactive discussion with the students and their families about potential interactions with the media. I have been in situations where the media have actually contacted surviving friends directly on their cell phones or through posting on Facebook and other social media to encourage them to talk to the media, even to the point of saying, if you really cared about your friend, you would come forward and talk about this. And what we tell them to do is, if they get those contacts, they're to come to their parents and to other people in the school so that we can discuss that with them and not to respond directly to the media if they're approached in that manner. If children, so what we try and do is insulate the children from the media, because the media should not be taking pictures or interviewing individuals who are acutely grieving. Sometimes it's very tempting for kids to get their moment on television, but they have to recognize that if they do that, they may not like the image that's portrayed, and that image may be shown on anniversaries and a stock photo, and they may see it quite a bit, and it may be something that they would prefer in retrospect not to have done. And so we usually discourage people from talking to the media directly if they are overwhelmed. But what we do work with the school is trying to figure out how they can proactively communicate with the media. So I have had kids, for example, develop some videotape of themselves saying something around the anniversary, which is presented to the media and shown. So for example, those video clips that I did show of the children talking about their experiences was because there was a desire to have some children on the webinar who had experienced loss. And my view was that that was difficult, uncontrolled, and might not be a positive experience for children. So I instead interviewed volunteer children. I mean, they actually had to volunteer to come in to, Scholastic to be taped. They were recruited from bereavement support groups. And so these are kids who already felt comfortable talking about their experiences. And we edited out anything that would have made them appear in a way that they might be uncomfortable with, and sought their permission. So I do think there are ways, but I think having the voice of children is useful. So we don't want to completely exclude them from any of the story, but we want to make sure that their participation is helpful to them and their needs come first. And then if they do wish to and can share something in a positive way about the experience, then that's useful. So for example, I don't know if people are familiar with StoryCorps. I believe they still feature it on NPR on Fridays, and this is where they're taking the oral history of the United States through having families and friends interview each other in soundproof booths. Well, they were doing a project on the impact of 9/11, and there was some consideration of then expanding that so that children could be included. Well, that meant that children would be interviewed about the deaths of close family members in a soundproof booth, literally in the middle of Grand Central Station. And so I said that that might be challenging for children because they're going to, talk about something that's deeply affected them and then walk out into the middle of Grand Central, and what type of supports would be in place, etc. So initially some comment was made, well, then we should exclude the children. And I said, but 9/11 has impacted them. They have a right to have a voice. We just have to think about how to do it in a way that's sensitive. So I actually met with the facilitators and did some training for them, came up with a guide that was prepared for how parents could interview their children, what to do if they had certain reactions, and how to make it a useful experience. And that project went forward, and I think was very useful to kids and I think to our country. So I know media poses certain challenges, and we need to try and minimize the distress that it causes. But we also have to recognize it has an important value and figure out how to include children. Of course, I've talked about one type of media. There's a whole other issue of social media. We actually even have one of the video modules is just on social media.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Our time is up. I don't want to ignore or not mention the fact that we've had other questions come in, and we've had quite a few comments of people that are just very thankful and grateful for your presentation. They really loved it, Dr. Schonfeld, so thank you so much. And just a reminder to everybody, we will be sending out an email in the next couple of days that will include a link to this presentation. Hopefully we will be able to have a link to the recording. We'll also share the link back to the website that he spoke about, thegrievingstudents.com and grieving.org, excuse me. And so we will be in touch. So thank you again, Dr. Schonfeld, and thanks to all for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.